Welcome to The Explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled to take you through a pretty wild piece of history today. We're going to look at a profound and honestly kind of chilling paradox: how two bitterly opposed, completely opposite totalitarian regimes actually managed to engineer nearly identical artistic cultures. Okay, let's dive right into this. How on earth did two bitter political enemies end up creating the exact same style of art? Think about it. You've got the Bolsheviks in Soviet Russia championing communism, and then you've got Mussolini's fascists in Italy. At the dawn of their revolutions, both of these regimes were fueled by vibrant, super radical avant garde artistic movements. Yet, in a crushing twist of irony, both governments eventually suffocated these revolutionary artists in favor of a shared, rigidly controlled aesthetic. To really understand why this happened, we have to look at the core problem for artists living under totalitarian rule. Benito Mussolini put it incredibly bluntly. He said, "Everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state." Almost overnight, art wasn't about personal expression or pushing the boundaries of imagination anymore. It was suddenly expected to serve the state entirely, acting as a direct weapon in their ideological struggle. Section 1. The rejected avant garde, a crushing irony. You see, political pragmatists like Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, well, they had zero patience for the wild experiments of the avant garde. Trotsky openly stated it was better that they should be left in the studios and not shown to the photographer. To the leaders of the revolution, the avant garde's complex abstraction was basically just useless gibberish. They viewed these vertiginous, high-concept projects as a dangerous interference in their own serious political work of refashioning the world. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what the state was rejecting. Take Vladimir Tatlin's wildly ambitious spiraling monument to the Third International, alongside El Lissitzky's geometric abstraction Prone No. 6. These pieces were visionary, massive, and entirely abstract. But the state, they just simply stopped commissioning them. They totally cut off the financial lifeblood of the movement, demanding instead art that the everyday worker could easily understand. But here's the really shocking part. The Soviet state didn't even have to officially ban these revolutionary artists at first. They just used economics. During the new economic policy, the government transferred these artists to a self-financing footing. In a ruined country where the state was literally the only viable patron with any money, this quiet bureaucratic move simply starved the avant-garde movement out. No bans needed, just defunding. Section 2. Mechanisms of cultural control. The bureaucratic machine. Let's shift our focus to how leaders like Lenin and Mussolini actually built the administrative machinery to enforce their artistic will right from the top down. Walking through this timeline reveals just how incredibly fast the door slammed shut on creative freedom. As early as 1905, Lenin is already proposing the idea of party literature. Fast forward to 1918, and he initiates a massive monumental propaganda plan. By 1920, the state-run newspaper Pravda is openly attacking futurism. And finally, in 1922, the AKKR, an association of realist artists, is formed specifically to serve the state. Art had been fully turned into a highly regulated state apparatus. All of this was driven by Lenin's strict concept of party spirit, which boldly demanded that culture abandon any and all individual initiative. He wanted creative activity to become merely the cogwheel and screw of one unique, great mechanism set in motion by the working class. Total accountability to the party was the new law of the land. Let's move to and see how this builds, because it definitely wasn't just happening in the Soviet Union. We have the USSR establishing the Ocher in 1922, and fascist Italy, they established the Novecento Italiano, also in exactly 1922. Both regimes, completely coincidentally and independently, created their primary state-aligned artistic movements in the exact same year. Both demanded an absolute end to modernism, replacing it with a heavily controlled traditional style. Take Giorgio de Chirico's 1924 self-portrait. Now, de Chirico had been a total master of modernism, but here he completely abandons it for what he called discipline, severity, and structure. This perfectly echoed the fascist call for Italianita, a strict return to classicism, traditional Italian roots, and a total purge of foreign abstract influences. Section 3. The rise of heroic realism, an interim style. So this interim style emerged as a highly specific aesthetic that bridged the gap between modernism and total state propaganda. We can define this style as constructive or heroic realism. It was deliberately purged of any old-fashioned bourgeois mood and focused entirely on projecting stern zeal and radiant exultation. It glorified labor, sport, struggle, the physical perfection of a so-called new man. Really, it was an art designed to mask the harsh, often brutal realities of these regimes behind a veil of relentless, forced optimism. Let's play a quick game of Spot the Difference. Look at Mario Soroni's Italian fascist squadron next to Yuri Pimenov's Soviet heavy industry. It's wild, right? Soroni's fascist detachments and Pimenov's Soviet miners are practically welded into the exact same solid, monumental blocks. Even though they represent deeply opposing political ideologies, the visual language is identical. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the shared, tense dynamism. Take Dyneka's Soviet factory builders and Petrovodkin's The Alarm. Both pieces completely strip away naturalism in favor of this highly stylized realism. This tense, rigid energy became the absolute hallmark of totalitarian aesthetics, regardless of whether the state was communist or fascist. We see this intense focus on the body as well. Just contrast Funi's Venus in Love with Samofalov's Girl Athlete. Both Italian neoclassicism and Soviet art absolutely zeroed in on physical perfection and strength. The human body basically became a canvas to reflect a supposed heroic, healthy reality that the state claimed to be building. Of course, there were slight national flavors. Take De Chirico's Gladiators or Cara's Lot's Daughters. Italy's style leaned heavily into its own specific national tradition of Roman antiquity and the Renaissance. This created a highly stylized pomposity, especially in mural painting, which, as you can imagine, suited Mussolini's imperial ambitions perfectly. Section 4. Nuances in Totalitarian Art, the Degrees of Terror. Now, while we've just seen how incredibly visually similar these art forms were, I want to point out that the actual lived experience of the artists trapped under these regimes was drastically different. The Soviet Union relied on the Cheka, a brutal secret police force, to maintain an absolute state monopoly on art. The private market was completely abolished. Fascist Italy, however, under the Ovra, actually maintained a surprisingly looser grip. They offered general ideological guidance, sure, but artists were actually still allowed to sell their work on a free market. So the crucial point is really captured in these staggering numbers, 280,000 versus 25. This represents a literally shocking disparity in state terror. By early 1922, the Soviet Cheka had killed approximately 280,000 people. In stark contrast, between 1926 and 1943, there were only 25 death sentences pronounced in Italy. The level of sheer systemic terror in the Soviet Union was just on a completely different scale. Because of this, surviving in fascist Italy actually offered tiny pockets of breathing room. Simply remaining loyal to your personal culture was a quiet form of anti-fascist protest. Painting a simple still life with bottles, writing hermetic private verses, or turning to Western modernism like Fauvism or Expressionism, these were small acts of rebellion. In Italy, artists could retreat to private galleries. That was a luxury that was totally and fatally impossible in the Soviet Union. Which brings us to our conclusion and a question I really want to leave you pondering today. If the ultimate goal of totalitarianism is order, at what point does the cost of that order permanently erase the freedom to imagine the future? We've seen how state-mandated heroism completely flattened the wild, beautiful imagination of the Avant Garde into a monolithic block. It's a heavy, heavy price to pay. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I hope it leaves you thinking deeply about the fragile, absolute, vital relationship between political freedom and artistic expression.